Now that we've laid the foundation for how to understand the perception parables, we can begin with a parable that explains how transformation actually happens, the parable of the growing seed. This is one of Jesus's most psychologically precise teachings. It describes the inner mechanics of transformation, how truth grows inside a person without their conscious management, and why psychological development, the deep reorganization of perception and identity, is not an act of force, but an act of alignment. And Jesus begins here because perception cannot develop until you understand the invisible processes that shape consciousness. Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome back to Biblical Reality Check. So, let's start with the parable itself. Jesus says in Mark chapter 4, verses 26 to 29, "This is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed on the land and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow, he knows not how. Of its own accord, the land yields fruit, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields the sickle at once, for the harvest has come." There are three characters in this parable: the man, the seed, and the soil. The man represents the conscious mind, the part of you that chooses, intends, plants, and initiates. He scatters the seed and begins the process. But after that, his role becomes limited. He cannot force the seed to grow. He cannot monitor the soil. He cannot accelerate the process. This is the first lesson in perception. The part of you that initiates the process is not the part that brings it to fruition. The seed represents divine intelligence. It contains its own blueprint. It knows what it is and knows what it is becoming. It grows according to its nature, not according to the man's anxiety. In psychological terms, the seed is the inner truth that has been planted in you, a new pattern, a new identity, a new way of perceiving reality. The soil is the subconscious mind, where the real transformation occurs. You don't see the soil, and you don't control it. You don't understand it, and yet this is where everything happens. When Jesus says, "The seed sprouts and grows, but he himself does not know," he is emphasizing that the man does not understand the mechanism of growth. He plants, he sleeps, he wakes, and time passes. All the while, beneath the surface, something is happening that he cannot see. This is the psychological reality of transformation. Most of your growth happens beneath conscious awareness. Modern neuroscience confirms this. Neuroplasticity shows that the brain rewires itself through repeated patterns, emotional experiences, and new interpretations. But this rewiring happens subconsciously. You don't feel synapses strengthening or neural pathways pruning. You only notice the result later: a calmer reaction, a new insight, a shift in your emotional baseline, a different way of seeing the world. Even when you don't notice it, the seed has been growing all along. Cognitive science shows that humans learn most things implicitly through exposure, repetition, and internalization. You don't consciously decide to understand something. Understanding emerges. This is what I am calling emergent understanding, and it is the kind of understanding Jesus is describing in this parable. However, to be clear, this is different from explicit understanding. Explicit understanding is conscious, fast, logical, and instructional. It's what happens in classrooms or when someone explains a concept step by step. You can choose to engage in it. Emergent understanding is different. It's subconscious, slow, and experience based. You cannot produce it directly, you cannot force it. It appears after inner growth has occurred. For instance, when a truth finally lands, when a reaction changes without effort, or when you realize you've become someone new. This kind of understanding is not taught, it emerges, and that is precisely the point of the parable. Here, it may help to take a brief step back to the Garden of Eden, not as an historical scene, but as a psychological allegory. In that story, God is not a character reacting emotionally. God is truth, moving through the garden of the mind, revealing what is real and what is being avoided. That same principle is operating in the parable of the growing seed. Truth in this framework is not static information, it's active. Like a seed, it contains its own pattern of transformation. Once it is received, it begins to work on the mind, clarifying, exposing, dissolving illusion, and strengthening what is real without requiring conscious control. This is why the seed grows by itself. Truth does not need to be managed, it only needs to be allowed. When Jesus describes a seed that grows night and day, whether the person is awake or asleep, he's describing the same psychological reality. Truth, once planted, reorganizes consciousness from the inside out. This is why the parable is a perception parable. It reveals how reality reshapes the self beneath awareness, quietly, patiently, and precisely, long before the mind understands what's happening. The man trusts the stages of growth and doesn't try to force it, which amazingly Jesus describes with the clarity of a clinical psychiatrist when he says, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. This is developmental psychology in symbolic form. First, the blade is symbolic of small shifts in perception. It indicates the subtle insights about the truth of who you really are and the new thoughts and emotional responses that emanate from those shifts and insights. These changes are all fragile and easily overlooked in the beginning of transformation. Then the ear is symbolic of when these changes become structural changes, where new patterns stabilize, new habits emerge, and your perception begins to reorganize. Then the full grain indicates maturity. This is when the new identity becomes stable, the changed perceptions become natural, and what was once effort becomes instinct. The perception series of videos begins with this parable because perception cannot develop without trust in the unseen. If you believe growth only counts when you can see it, you will abandon the process too early. If you believe you must control the outcome, you will interfere with the very thing you're trying to cultivate. The growing seed teaches the first movement of perception, seeing the invisible and recognizing that the deepest transformations occur in silence, in darkness, in the hidden places of the subconscious. When you understand this, you stop panicking in the quiet seasons. You stop doubting the process. You stop uprooting what you planted and you begin to trust the intelligence of the seed. And that trust becomes the foundation for everything that follows in this series, from recognizing hidden value to discerning ultimate value to sorting truth from illusion to perceiving timing. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video, where we turn to the parable of the hidden treasure and examine how awareness shifts from trusting unseen growth to recognizing intrinsic worth. the second stage in the evolution of perception.